In a galaxy once ruled by the iron grip of the Galactic Dominion, a revolution is about to unfold, one that will shake the stars themselves. When humanity, a species barely a century old in the galactic scene, dares to challenge the oppressive reign of an ancient empire, the very foundation of the galaxy begins to tremble. But how far can a single determined species go when they rise up against the powerful, the elite, and the untouchable? This is the story of Captain Jack Harper and the fight for a new galaxy where no one species reigns supreme and the future of every being is up for grabs. Get ready for a journey filled with betrayal, power struggles, and the fierce will to change the world, because the revolution is just beginning. The Grand Hall was bathed in an almost blinding light, as if the stars themselves had been miniaturized and affixed to the walls with impossible precision. The Senate chamber of the Galactic Dominion was a marvel of engineering, designed to accommodate representatives from over 2,000 different civilizations. Each of the towering columns in the hall radiated light, and the air was thick with the scent of perfumes, pheromones, and the sharp tang of politics. I stood there, Ambassador Quill of the Volpari, trying to maintain my composure as my eyes were fixated on one singular figure at the center of the room. Vox Taller, Supreme Ruler of the Galactic Dominion, strutted into the chamber with the kind of arrogance only a 1,000-year-old despot could muster. His 6 limbs, glistening with iridescent scales, seemed to glow under the artificial suns that illuminated the hall. He moved with an air of unshakable confidence, every step calculated, every gesture designed to reinforce his status as the absolute ruler of the galaxy. "Behold the sovereign of the stars," I whispered to my colleague Dredge. 10,000 years of civilization, and we still answer to someone who believes gold-plated hover platforms are the peak of refinement. Dredge, a Volpari with rust-colored fur and piercing eyes that could read the truth from the most intricate of lies, let out a dry chuckle. "Ambassador Quill, your observations about our esteemed emperor are bordering on treason." "Treason?" I scoffed, straightening my ceremonial robes. "Not if it's the truth." As the Volpari ambassador, I had the misfortune of attending every pompous speech Vox Taylor deigned to deliver to the Senate. The chamber itself was a testament to excess. Massive domed ceilings, rare minerals imported from across the galaxy, seats for every representative from over 2,000 worlds. "The human delegation is late again," Dredge noted, glancing toward the empty section reserved for Earth and its colonies. "Can you blame them? Last time they were here, Vox Taylor called them ambitious primates who should be grateful we don't keep them in zoos." I adjusted my translation implant, but glitching again. Not exactly diplomatic. The chamber grew silent as Vox Taylor's hover platform descended to the central podium. His scales shimmered with every movement, casting rainbows of light across the walls. It was impressive if you were into that sort of thing. "Esteemed representatives of the Galactic Dominion," Vox Taylor's voice boomed, amplified effortlessly throughout the chamber. "We gather today to address the growing instability in the Outer Rim territories." My ears perked up at the mention of the Outer Rim. That's where Earth and its colonies were located. There had been whispers of unrest for weeks, rumors of rebellion that had reached even the distant reaches of my home world. The species known as humans had begun to display concerning patterns of behavior. "They expand beyond their allocated zones?" Vox Taylor continued, his secondary limbs gesturing dramatically. "They modify our technologies without permission, and they question the wisdom of the Dominion's laws." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Several senators nodded in agreement. Humans had only joined the galactic community a century ago, after we graciously discovered their planet and extended the hand of membership. But in that short time, they had begun to stir the pot. Most species took millennia to advance from first contact to interstellar travel. Humans had done it in mere decades. It made many species nervous. Therefore, Vox Taylor announced, "I am implementing Directive 57B effective immediately. All human vessels will be required to carry Dominion observers. All human colonies will be subject to resource quotas. All human technologies will require Dominion approval before implementation." The chamber erupted into a mixture of applause and shocked whispers. Directive 57B was essentially placing humans under galactic probation. The last time it had been invoked was against the Krell, a species who went extinct when they couldn't adapt to the restrictions. "This is madness," I muttered to Dredge. "The humans won't stand for this." "They don't have a choice," Dredge replied, his whiskers twitching nervously. "No single species can stand against the Dominion." As if on cue, the massive doors at the entrance to the chamber burst open. A single figure stood silhouetted against the bright light from the corridor beyond. Speaking of humans, I thought, recognizing the familiar bipedal shape. The figure strode into the room, and gasps echoed throughout the chamber. It was indeed a human, but not just any human. It was Captain Jack Harper, Earth's appointed representative to the Senate, and he was dragging something behind him. "Is that?" Dredge's voice trailed off in disbelief. "I believe it is," I replied, equally stunned. Captain Harper was dragging the bloodied, unconscious body of Grand Admiral Z, Vox Taylor's most feared enforcer and the commander of the Dominion's vast military. Harper's uniform was torn and scorched in several places. A nasty gash ran across his forehead, dripping blood down his face, but his eyes, those strange, round human eyes, burned with a fury I had never witnessed in any species. "Emperor Vox Taylor," Harper bellowed, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. "I bring you a message from Earth." Vox Taylor's scales flattened against his body, a sign of extreme agitation for the Zeltari. "How dare you interrupt these proceedings? Guards, seize this barbarian." The Dominion guards, towering armored beings bred specifically for protection, began to advance toward Harper, but they hesitated when the human pulled out a small device from his pocket. "I wouldn't," Harper said, his voice suddenly calm, terrifyingly calm. "Unless you want the same thing that happened to your fleet at Proxima Centauri to happen here." Vox Taylor's eyes widened. "What nonsense is this? My fleet is conducting standard operations at Proxima Centauri." Harper laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that sent chills down my spine. "Your fleet, Emperor, no longer exists. 17 dreadnoughts, 53 cruisers, and over 200 support vessels. Gone." The chamber exploded into chaos. I turned to Dredge, who was frantically checking his personal communication device. "He's telling the truth," Dredge whispered, his fur standing on end. "I have contacts in the military. They're saying the Proxima Centauri fleet went dark 3 hours ago." "Impossible," I breathed. "The Dominion fleet was the most powerful military force in the known galaxy. No single species could possibly—" "You thought you could subjugate us?" Harper continued, dragging the still unconscious Admiral Z toward the central podium. "You thought we were just another species to add to your collection? Another race to exploit until we either submitted or died out?" He reached the bottom of Vox Taylor's platform, leaving a trail of purplish blood across the immaculate floor. "But there's something you should have learned about humans." Harper's voice dropped to a near whisper, but somehow every being in the chamber could hear him perfectly. "We don't take kindly to bullies." The Emperor's hover platform began to rise, attempting to retreat from the advancing human. "This is an act of war. The entire Dominion will crush your pathetic species for this outrage." Harper reached into another pocket and pulled out a small, metallic sphere. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it toward the platform. It attached itself to the underside with a soft clicking sound. The platform's engines died immediately, causing it to crash back to the floor with a deafening bang. Vox Taylor tumbled from his ornate throne, his scales losing their luster as he sprawled ungracefully on the ground. "War?" Harper said, approaching the fallen Emperor. "No, Your Highness, this isn't war. This is revolution, Mike." The chamber was unnervingly silent, the weight of Vox Taylor's announcement hanging in the air like a dense fog. The tension was palpable, a crackling energy that seemed to stretch the very fabric of space itself. Across the massive Senate hall, every pair of eyes was fixated on the Emperor, his iridescent scales now dulled with the sudden shock of the human's bold entrance. The room felt like it had frozen in time, but for one man, Captain Jack Harper, time had already sped up. Harper stood there, his chest heaving, the body of Grand Admiral Z still draped across his shoulder. The human didn't move an inch, his eyes locked on Vox Taylor with the intensity of a predator who had just cornered his prey. The sheer audacity of it was enough to send shivers down my spine. Humans. No one had ever dared to challenge the Dominion so openly, and certainly not to this scale. Vox Taylor recovered quickly, his face twisting into a scowl, but there was something different about him now. something less certain. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, replaced by the prickling anxiety of someone who realized, perhaps for the first time, that his empire was not invincible. The silence stretched longer, stretching the already strained nerves of every representative in the room. The Emperor's voice broke the tension like a blade cutting through cloth. "I will not tolerate these insults," he declared, his tone icy and commanding. "Guards, remove him immediately." But Harper didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly reached into his torn uniform and pulled out a small glowing device. A low hum filled the room as the device activated, sending a pulse of energy through the air, briefly distorting the electromagnetic field around us. The guards hesitated, their movements frozen, as though the very atmosphere had turned against them. "I wouldn't move if I were you," Harper said, his voice steady, dangerously calm. "Unless you want the same thing that happened to your fleet at Proxima Centauri to happen right here. And I'm sure your Emperor doesn't want that, do you?" A murmur rippled through the Senate. I turned to Dredge, my ever-watchful colleague, his fur standing on end. Dredge had never looked so unsettled before. He's telling the truth," he whispered, almost as if he couldn't believe it himself. The Emperor's face twisted with disbelief. "What nonsense is this? My fleet is conducting standard operations at Proxima Centauri." Harper's laugh cut through Vox Taylor's denial, sharp and humorless, sending a ripple of unease through the room. "Not anymore," he said. "Your fleet, Vox Taylor, no longer exists. 17 dreadnoughts, 53 cruisers, over 200 support vessels. Gone." For a moment, it felt as if the entire universe held its breath. The silence was deafening, the tension so thick that you could feel it pressing in on your chest. Vox Taylor's eyes widened, his scowl faltering as the enormity of Harper's words sank in. The Emperor's military, the most powerful fleet in the known galaxy, had been wiped out in a single unthinkable moment by humans. It was a staggering blow to his pride, one that no amount of political cunning could ever erase. The chamber erupted into chaos. Representatives scrambled to their feet, shouting in disbelief, calling for action, for vengeance. Some seemed to lean toward anger, others confusion, but the fear was palpable. This wasn't just an attack on Vox Taylor, it was an attack on everything the Dominion represented. It was an open declaration that the seemingly invincible empire was no longer untouchable. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I watched the scene unfold. Dredge, too, was checking his communication device frantically. His eyes darted across the room, flicking between the holographic screens and the unfolding drama before us. "I have contacts in the military," he murmured. "They're saying the Proxima Centauri fleet went dark 3 hours ago. It's true." I felt my breath catch. Impossible. The Dominion fleet was the most powerful military force in the galaxy. No single species, no matter how it could ever hope to challenge them. But the humans had done it, and they had done it without firing a single shot. Harper, unfazed by the chaos around him, took a step forward. He dragged the limp body of Admiral Z, whose blood was now staining the pristine floor, leaving a trail of purple as if to mark this moment in history. "You thought you could subjugate us," Harper said, his voice steady, his words cutting through the din of shocked gasps. "You thought we were just another species to add to your collection, another race to exploit until we either submitted or died out." His words landed like a hammer striking an anvil, each syllable resonating with power. The arrogance of the Dominion, the cruelty of their rule, was being laid bare for all to see. Harper reached the base of Vox Taylor's platform, dropping Admiral Z at the Emperor's feet like a discarded puppet. "But there's something you should have learned about humans," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, but carrying through the room as though it were thunder. "We don't take kindly to bullies." Vox Taylor recoiled slightly as if struck, his scales flickering as his emotions surged through him. The Emperor had been challenged, humiliated, and now, as the reality of the situation began to sink in, the fear was unmistakable. This was no longer about diplomacy or politics. It was about survival. Harper's next movement was deliberate. With a single flick of his wrist, he threw a small metallic sphere toward the hovering platform. The room went silent again as the device made a soft clicking sound when it attached itself to the underside of Vox Taylor's throne. There was a brief, electric hum, and then the engines of the Emperor's platform sputtered and died. The platform crashed to the ground with a thunderous bang, the ornate structure rattling as Vox Talar tumbled from his perch. The once mighty Emperor sprawled ungracefully on the floor, his golden robes crumpling beneath him. The Emperor had fallen, not just from his throne, but from his pedestal of invincibility. Harper stood over him, unbothered by the spectacle he had caused. "War?" he asked, his tone casual, as though the entire galaxy wasn't watching in disbelief. "No, Your Highness. This isn't war." Harper paused for a moment, letting the words hang in the air before continuing. "This is revolution." The weight of his words settled over the room, the shock in the air so thick it could be cut with a knife. Vox Talar, the so-called ruler of the stars, lay on the floor before them like any other helpless being. The illusion had shattered. The mighty empire of the Galactic Dominion was not invulnerable, and humanity, with all its flaws and all its ambition, had just proven it. The silence in the Senate Hall was like a living thing, vibrating with tension. The Emperor of the Galactic Dominion, once a symbol of unshakable power, lay in the center of the room, sprawled across the floor in a tangle of golden robes. His scales, once gleaming with pride, were now dull with humiliation. The grand platform that had once held him high above his subjects now lay broken, a symbol of his empire's crumbling facade. Captain Jack Harper stood calmly over him, his eyes not filled with anger but with a quiet resolve, as if this moment had been years in the making. The body of Grand Admiral Zay, the Dominion's most feared military leader, still lay crumpled at Harper's feet, a silent reminder of how the mighty had fallen. Vox Talar struggled to his feet, his once imposing figure now seeming smaller, diminished. He stared up at Harper, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and fury. What have you done?" His voice, usually a booming command, now cracked with uncertainty. Harper did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the gathered representatives, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and fascination. "What we've done," he said slowly, "is remind you that no empire lasts forever, not even yours." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was still, but the air had shifted. The unspoken question hung in the air like a dark cloud. What comes next? "We didn't come here to destroy your empire," Harper continued, his voice steady and clear. "We came here to change it, to show you that the galaxy is no longer just a playground for the powerful. It's a place for all of us." I watched as Harper's words landed with an unsettling calmness. There were no cries for revenge, no calls for war. Instead, there was a chilling sense of inevitability in his tone, a sense that humanity had already won, not through force, but through the power of truth. Vox Talar took a step back, his chest heaving as he processed the weight of Harper's words. "You dare speak to me like this? You're just a human, a barbarian," he spat, his voice growing weaker. Harper's smile was cold. "That's where you're wrong, Vox Talar. You think of us as primitive, as nothing more than ambitious primates. But let me tell you something. This barbarian just wiped out your fleet in a single stroke, and we didn't even need to fire a shot." The room was silent again, but this time the silence wasn't born of shock. It was born of realization. For the first time in millennia, the Dominion was faced with the uncomfortable truth. They were no longer the dominant force in the galaxy. The Emperor, for the first time in his long reign, looked uncertain. He glanced around the room, perhaps searching for support, but all eyes were on him. The once unified Dominion was fracturing in front of his very eyes. His military had been obliterated, his authority questioned, and now his very existence was being challenged. I glanced at Dredge, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation. His eyes, sharp and calculating, were now filled with something I hadn't seen before. Hope, the hope that had long been buried in his species, the hope that a new order could rise from the ashes of the old one. A true federation, one where every species had a say, not just the powerful few. But that hope was fragile, like the flicker of a candle in a storm. I knew it wouldn't be easy. The Dominion was not a beast that would roll over without a fight, but Harper's actions had opened a door, and now it was up to the galaxy to decide whether they would walk through it. Harper turned back to Vox Talar, his face a mask of determination. "I didn't come here to destroy you, Vox Talar. I came here to give you a chance to evolve, to change, to be something better than the tyranny you've built." His gaze locked with the Emperor's, and there was something in his eyes that wasn't there before. something that spoke not just to the Emperor, but to the entire galaxy. "This is your choice," Harper said, his voice ringing with finality. "The galaxy will either continue down the path of oppression and decay, or it will rise as something new. But that choice is no longer yours to make alone. It's ours, too." For a moment, the room was still again, the only sound the faint hum of the artificial suns above. And then, in the quiet, a single voice broke through. The voice of one of the senators from a distant world. "What do you want from us?" Harper's eyes shifted to the speaker, his expression unreadable. "We want a seat at the table," he said simply. "Equal representation, a voice in the decisions that affect us all." The room erupted into murmurs again, but this time there was a different tone. There was no longer just fear. There was curiosity, skepticism, but also something new, a desire to hear more. The spark had been lit. Vox Taller stepped back, his hands clenched into fists. "You think you can dictate terms to me? To the Dominion?" His voice was quieter now, more controlled, but the fury was still there, simmering beneath the surface. Harper didn't flinch. "No, Emperor," he replied calmly. "We're not dictating terms. We're starting a conversation, one that's been long overdue." I looked around the chamber, at the faces of the representatives who had once bowed before Vox Taller's every command. They were watching now, not in fear, but in something else, a growing realization that the galaxy they knew was changing. The Empire was no longer the only game in town. Vox Taller turned sharply, his eyes wild with a mix of rage and disbelief. "You'll regret this," he hissed before turning to leave the chamber. But Harper wasn't finished. "This isn't about revenge," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber with unshakable conviction. "It's about building something better. And if that means tearing down everything you've built to start again, then so be it." The Emperor didn't respond. He simply stormed out of the room, his guards trailing behind him, unsure of what to do. The once feared ruler of the galaxy had been forced to retreat, not through military might, but through a simple act of defiance. A human had walked into his throne room, dragged his enforcer across the floor, and humiliated him in front of the entire galaxy. And now the conversation was beginning. As Vox Taylor's presence faded from the room, Harper turned to the representatives, his expression softening. "We don't want war," he said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "We want peace, we want equality, and we're willing to fight for it." The room was silent once more, but this time, it was not in fear. It was in contemplation. The seed had been planted, and there was no turning back. The aftermath of that day hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. The Grand Senate chamber, once a place of pomp and ritual, had transformed. What had been a symbol of unyielding power now felt like a fragile shell, cracking under the weight of its own corruption. The Galactic Order was no longer as certain as it once was. There were whispers, murmurs in the corridors in every corner of the galaxy. They spoke of humans, ambitious, bold, defiant, and of the single moment when they had upended the rules that had governed the stars for millennia. Captain Jack Harper had delivered a message, not just to the Emperor, but to the entire galaxy. And that message was clear. The Dominion, as it was finished. The question now wasn't whether the Empire would fall. It was how it would change. I stood on the balcony of the Senate building, gazing out at the sprawling city below. New Century Prime, the heart of the Galactic Dominion, had always been a place of grandeur, where the wealth and power of the Empire were on full display. But tonight, the lights of the city seemed different, less vibrant, as if the pulse of the Empire itself had slowed. The streets, usually filled with the throngs of admirals, senators, and dignitaries, were quieter. The air seemed to hum with a different energy, one that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Dredge stood beside me, his keen eyes scanning the horizon. "Do you think it'll hold?" he asked, his voice low and laced with uncertainty. I turned to him, studying his face. Dredge had always been the pragmatic one, the voice of reason. But today, even he seemed unsure, and the galaxy had always been a place of vast empires and endless wars. It had always been dominated by the strong, the unyielding. But now, the balance was shifting. "I don't know," I admitted, "but something's changed. For the first time, I don't think the Dominion can ignore humanity anymore." The door to the balcony slid open, and Harper stepped out, his face still bearing the marks of the brutal confrontation in the Senate. His uniform was torn, and his hands, though steady, bore the weight of what he had just done. He had dragged an emperor across the floor, humiliated him in front of the galaxy, and yet he walked with the confidence of someone who knew the tides of history had shifted in his favor. He took a moment to breathe in the cool night air before turning to us. "The ball is rolling," he said, his voice grim but resolute. "Now, we have to make sure it doesn't stop." I nodded. The message was clear. The revolution had begun, but the hard part was just starting. Vox Talar had been humiliated, but his reign hadn't ended. Not yet. He still held power, still commanded a vast military, and still had loyalists scattered across the galaxy. The real fight was ahead of us. The hard fight. "Have you heard from the other factions?" Dredge asked, his voice carrying a note of tension. Harper's lips curled into a half-smile. "I've made a few calls. Some are cautious, some are intrigued, but they're waiting. Everyone's waiting to see what happens next. It's not just the Dominion," I added. "The galaxy itself is watching. There's a power vacuum now, one that could go in any direction." Harper nodded, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the distance. "I know, but that's what we need to take advantage of. We can't just tear down the Empire. We have to build something better in its place. A new order. One where every species has a voice. One where power doesn't just belong to the strongest, but to those who deserve it." I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me. It wasn't just about surviving the fall of the Empire. It was about reshaping the entire galaxy, about creating something that had never existed before. True equality among species, true cooperation. But that was an ideal, a dream. The reality was much grimmer. "We'll need allies," Dredge said, his voice quiet but firm, "and we can't afford to alienate anyone right now, especially not the neutral worlds." Harper's eyes flashed with understanding. "That's why we have to move carefully. We need to start by offering a seat at the table. We need to show the galaxy that we're not just here to destroy, we're here to rebuild, to offer something better." "And what happens if they refuse?" I asked, my voice more cautious than I intended. Harper's gaze darkened. "Then we'll make them see that this is the only way forward." I felt a chill run through me at his words. The humans were fierce. They had proven that already. But they weren't just warriors. They were survivors. And in the galactic stage, survival meant change. And change meant conflict. "Are we ready for this?" I asked, my voice tinged with doubt. "We don't have a choice," Harper replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's happening, whether we're ready or not." As the night deepened, a soft hum filled the air. The artificial suns above the city flickered, casting long shadows across the sprawling urban landscape. The lights, once symbols of the Dominion's vast power, now felt like mere beacons of a fading empire. The people of the galaxy, those who had once bowed to the Dominion, who had lived under the Emperor's reign, were waking up. They were beginning to realize that they had a choice, too. The winds of change had begun to blow, and the storm that followed would either break the galaxy apart or rebuild it, piece by piece. The days after Captain Harper's bold display in the Senate were a blur of diplomatic maneuvering, tense conversations, and the quiet weight of uncertainty hanging over the galaxy. Vox Talar, once the unchallenged ruler of the Dominion, had been forced into an uneasy retreat, his authority shaken to its core. But the real challenge had only just begun. For every victory, there was 1,000 battles yet to be fought. Not with weapons, but with words, with alliances, with the slow, painstaking work of rebuilding the very fabric of the galaxy. I had spent the past few days in countless meetings, each one a delicate balancing act. Dredge, ever the cautious one, had been by my side, urging caution, warning against alienating too many factions too quickly. The neutral worlds were a key to the success of our vision. Without their support, we risked everything. But Harper had been unwavering. He believed in the strength of humanity. He believed that what had happened in that Senate chamber, the humiliation of Vox Talar, was not just a symbolic victory. It was the first step in a much larger transformation. We couldn't just tear the Empire down and walk away. We had to rebuild it, piece by piece, creating a new order where every species had a voice, where power was no longer monopolized by the few. It was a bold vision, a dangerous one, but it was the only one worth fighting for. The meeting room was stark and utilitarian, a sharp contrast to the opulent grandeur of the Senate Hall. A long, rectangular table sat in the center of the room, its surface gleaming under the cold light of the artificial suns. Around it sat representatives from a dozen different species, each of them eyeing one another with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. The representatives of the neutral worlds had arrived, but none of them had come with the enthusiasm I had hoped for. There was no applause, no sign of gratitude for the opportunity to be heard. Just silence. Silence, and the tension that filled the air like static. I sat at the head of the table, my fingers lightly tapping on the surface, a habit I had developed during tense moments. Dredge sat beside me, his eyes scanning the room, always alert. Captain Harper stood near the window, his arms folded, his gaze distant as he looked out at the sprawling city below. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on us all. This was it, the beginning of the new order, or its failure. Harper turned to face us, his expression intense but calm. "We've already made one thing clear," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his previous actions. "This is not just about power. This is about respect, equality, the chance for every species to have a say in their future." A murmur ran through the room, some voices skeptical, others intrigued. The representatives were still hesitant, unsure of whether they could trust a human, a species so young in the grand scheme of the galaxy, to truly lead a revolution, to create a future where every voice mattered. "What makes you think this will work?" The voice came from the far end of the table, a tall, thin being with scales that shimmered like liquid gold. It was Ambassador Kron, a representative from the Zelny, one of the oldest and most powerful species in the galaxy. His people had always been at the top, pulling the strings behind the scenes. They weren't interested in equality, they were interested in control. "We're not asking for control," Harper replied, his voice unwavering. "We're asking for cooperation, a chance to build something that benefits all of us, not just the few at the top." Kron's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as if considering whether to dismiss Harper's words as naive or to take them seriously. "I don't think you understand," Kron said after a long pause, his voice sharp. "This galaxy has functioned for millennia under the Dominion's rule. It's a structure that works. At least, it did. You can't just tear it down and expect everything to fall into place." Harper didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his gaze locked with Kron's. "What's been working for the last 10,000 years hasn't been a system of cooperation. It's been a system of subjugation. You've ruled through fear, through manipulation, and through brute force. The old way is broken, and we're here to fix it." The room fell silent, the tension thickening. Kron opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was still trying to process the audacity of it all. The sheer idea that a species so young, so untested, could topple the Dominion and then offer a better solution was unthinkable. "Why should we believe you?" Another voice interjected, this time from a representative of the Ziri, a species known for their neutrality and wisdom. Their soft, lilting voice carried an air of reason. "What makes you think you can rebuild an empire that took thousands of years to form? You've barely begun to understand the complexities of this galaxy." Harper met the Ziri representative's gaze with a steady, unyielding look. "Because we've already begun," he said, "and the people, your people, are already seeing the cracks in the Dominion. The fall of Vox Talar wasn't just a fluke, it was a warning. The galaxy is changing whether we like it or not. The only question now is whether we choose to lead that change or resist it until it breaks us all." A silence fell over the room, heavy with the weight of his words. The representatives, once so eager to dismiss Harper and his ideals, were now starting to listen. Starting to consider the possibility that humanity, so new, so raw, might be the very spark this galaxy needed. The conversation continued late into the night, each representative raising objections, concerns, and questions. But for the first time, there was something different in the air, something resembling hope. Hope that the future didn't have to be defined by the same cycles of tyranny and rebellion. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something better. As the meeting ended, Harper stepped outside onto the balcony, his face expressionless but his eyes alight with a fire that refused to die. Dredge and I followed him, our footsteps echoing softly on the cold stone floor. "Do you think they'll come around?" I asked quietly. Harper didn't answer immediately. He just stared out at the vast city below, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something. Maybe the future itself. "They'll have to," he said finally, his voice soft but certain. "There's no other choice now." The dawn of the new era was not heralded with fanfare or celebration. It came quietly, like the first rays of light creeping over a horizon that had long been shrouded in darkness. The galaxy had been in turmoil for as long as anyone could remember, held together by the iron fist of the Dominion and the fear it instilled in its subjects. Now that fist had loosened, and in its place, a tremor of possibility ran through the stars. I stood on the observation deck of the New Century Prime Command Center, gazing out at the sprawling city beneath me. The skyline was a chaotic jumble of towering spires, each one a symbol of the opulence the Dominion had once reveled in. Now, there was a strange stillness in the air. The weight of change was undeniable. But the question that lingered in the back of my mind, in the minds of so many, was whether the change would come to fruition, or if the galaxy would descend into chaos once again. Harper had been moving quickly. After the Senate session, he had called for an emergency summit with the leaders of the neutral worlds, the ones who had hesitated to take sides during the uprising. The talks were tense, with each representative vying for their own interests. But something had shifted. The galaxy was waking up. And that was exactly what we needed. But it wasn't easy. The Dominion's influence ran deep. Vox Taylor's supporters were still powerful, and their loyalists in the military were ready to strike if the new order didn't hold. Every step we took toward building a new galaxy felt like a step closer to the edge of a precipice. One misstep, one miscalculation, and the fall would be inevitable. Ambassador Quill, Dredge's voice broke through my thoughts, his tone clipped and urgent. I turned to find him approaching, his expression more serious than usual. "You should come to the briefing. Harper's about to speak to the neutral worlds. Things are moving faster than we anticipated." I nodded, my mind already shifting gears. "Let's go." The briefing room was packed. Representatives from hundreds of worlds had gathered, each one brimming with uncertainty and wariness. Some were still wearing the heavy armor of their people, others in the flowing robes of diplomats, but the atmosphere was thick, with a shared sense of anticipation. A silent understanding passed between the beings present. The galaxy was at a crossroads, and they were all here to decide which direction it would take. Harper stood at the front of the room, his expression focused. His uniform was no longer torn from the confrontation in the Senate, but the remnants of battle were still visible in the dark circles under his eyes. He had not slept in days. None of us had. He met each representative's gaze, his piercing eyes unflinching. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of an impending decision. "We stand at the precipice of history. What happens here today will define the future of the galaxy." I watched as Harper spoke, his words deliberate and measured. He wasn't just addressing them as a leader, he was speaking to them as a human. And there was something about that, something raw, something real, that the galaxy had never seen before. "We are not here to destroy the Dominion," Harper continued. "We are here to rebuild, to create a galaxy where every species has a voice, where no one is subjugated, where every being can live in freedom. But to do that, we need your support." There was a murmur in the room, a ripple of tension. Some were intrigued, others skeptical, but the air seemed to hum with the possibility of change. Harper didn't wait for the murmurs to die down. He pressed on, his voice growing more impassioned. "The Dominion has ruled for millennia through fear, through violence, but fear is not a foundation that can last forever. The truth is, the Empire was built on borrowed time. The systems of control, the lies, it all starts to unravel when you realize that no one can truly control the stars." A representative from one of the more aggressive factions, a tall, angular species with glowing blue eyes, stood up, his voice cutting through the room. "You speak of rebellion, of revolution, but you do not understand what you ask of us. The Dominion is not simply a power structure, it is a way of life for us. You want us to throw away everything we've built? For what? A world of chaos?" Harper's gaze never wavered. "I understand what you've built," he said, his voice unwavering. "But what you've built is a house of cards, one that's been built on the backs of the oppressed. And the moment that house falls, there will be nothing left. We cannot continue down this path." The representative's eyes narrowed, but before he could speak, another voice, one I hadn't expected to hear, broke through. I agree with him. The room fell silent. A few heads turned in surprise, and I couldn't help but feel a stir of hope rise in my chest. It was Dr. Lena Ortiz, the human strategist who had been working alongside Harper. She stepped forward, her posture straight and confident. The Dominion has failed, she continued, her voice calm but sharp. Not because it wasn't effective. It was, for a time, but because it was built on a lie, and lies never last forever. Her words hit like a thunderclap, reverberating across the room. Some of the representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others began to murmur in agreement. Harper nodded at her, a silent acknowledgement of the strength she had shown since the beginning of this journey. Dr. Ortiz is right, he said, his voice firm. This isn't about destroying everything you've built. It's about creating something better. A federation that truly represents every species. A place where no one has to live in fear, where every voice counts, and we're offering you a seat at that table. There was a long silence, the kind that felt like it stretched on forever. The room was filled with conflicting emotions, fear, hope, uncertainty, but through it all there was one common thread, the possibility of a new beginning. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a voice spoke. You have our attention, Captain Harper, said a representative from the neutral worlds, his voice slow but steady. Now, show us that you can back your words with action. Harper's eyes shone with determination. We already have, he said, his voice strong, and we will continue to. Together, we will build the future of this galaxy, and we will do it with you, not against you. As the meeting adjourned, I felt a flicker of something deep within me, something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the kind of fleeting hope that fades with time, but a hope rooted in something real, something tangible. The winds of change had begun to blow, and for the first time in my life, I believed they would carry us all to something better. Outside the window, the city of New Century Prime glittered in the darkness, a symbol of everything that had been. But beyond it, the stars were waiting, and with them, the possibility of a new galaxy, one where all species, no matter their size or strength, had a chance to rise together. The city of New Century Prime, once a gleaming beacon of the Galactic Dominion's power, was now a fractured monument to the old ways. The streets, filled with people of every shape and color, had an energy that felt different now. Something was in the air, something that hadn't been there before. Change. The kind of change that could break empires and reshape the stars themselves. Captain Harper stood on the balcony of his temporary quarters, looking out over the city. The skyline stretched before him, tall spires and glass towers glimmering in the fading light. His expression was unreadable, but the wariness in his posture spoke volumes. He had fought for this moment. He had dragged Vox Taylor across the Senate floor, humiliated the Empire, and sparked a revolution. But now, as the dust began to settle, he was left wondering if it had all been enough. Behind him, Dredge and I walked into the room, the door sliding shut behind us with a soft hiss. We had just returned from yet another round of talks, this time with representatives from the Captain Dominion, the last faction still holding out. There had been progress, but it was slow, methodical, like trying to piece together an ancient artifact with hands trembling from exhaustion. "How's it going?" Harper asked, his voice low, though he didn't turn to face us. "It's happening," Dredge said, his tone tinged with skepticism. "But it's fragile, too many forces pulling in different directions. The neutral worlds are still on the fence. The loyalists of the old Dominion are stirring, and they're not going to let go without a fight." I could see the doubt creeping into Dredge's eyes. The same doubt that had been gnawing at me since we first set foot on New Century Prime. No matter how many steps forward we took, there always seemed to be another obstacle waiting in the wings. And worse still, I could see the cracks in the alliances we had forged. Tension, fear, uncertainty, they were building like a storm on the horizon. Harper finally turned, his eyes meeting mine. "I know it's hard. The path ahead isn't going to be easy, but we can't stop now. Not when we've come this far." His words had the weight of a promise, but there was something about the way he said them that made me wonder if he truly believed them, or if he was simply trying to convince himself. "We have to keep pushing," I said, my voice more certain than I felt. If we let up now, everything will fall apart." Harper nodded, but I could see the weariness etched in his features. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't a god. He was human, just like the rest of us. And the burden of leading a revolution, of reshaping the galaxy itself, was a weight that no one should have to bear alone. "We can't do it without the support of the factions," Dredge said, his eyes narrowing as he crossed his arms. "We need the Quran. They're the last major power standing in our way." Harper's jaw tightened. "I know, but we're getting there. The Quran might not be easy to sway, but they're pragmatic, and they see what's coming. They know the Dominion is on its last legs." I could feel a chill in the air as the weight of those words sank in. Vox Taylor's reign had been a brutal one, built on fear and control. But the truth was undeniable. His empire had crumbled. And the galaxy, for the first time in millennia, was waking up to the possibility of something better, a galaxy that could be ruled by cooperation instead of dominance. But that dream felt so far away when the forces of the old Dominion were still so entrenched. The next day, we gathered in the Senate once again. This time, the atmosphere was different, charged, expectant. The representatives of the neutral worlds had agreed to meet with us in a final push for the future of the galaxy. This was our last chance to secure the alliances we needed before the Dominion loyalists could regroup. I stood at the back of the room, my eyes scanning the faces of the leaders from across the galaxy. Each one had their own motives, their own fears, their own vision of what the future should look like. Some wanted peace, some wanted power, and some simply wanted survival. Captain Harper stood at the front, his presence commanding the room. His voice echoed through the chamber as he spoke, each word carrying the weight of everything we had fought for. "Today, we make history," he said, his tone firm. "Today, we build the future of the galaxy. Not as separate factions, but as a united force working together for the benefit of all species." The room was quiet, the silence so thick you could almost taste it. The representatives were listening, but whether they were truly hearing him was another question. It wasn't just about speeches and promises, it was about action. And that was something the Dominion had never been good at, listening to the voices of the people. But Harper was speaking in a way that resonated with them, with all of us. He wasn't just asking for change, he was demanding it. The Quran representative, a tall, narrow-eyed figure, stood up, his movements slow but deliberate. "You want us to abandon the system that has kept the galaxy stable for centuries," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "To trust in a human-led federation? Do you think we're all so naive?" Harper's expression didn't falter. "I'm asking you to trust in something more than just the system," he replied. "I'm asking you to trust in the future, in a galaxy where every voice is heard, where no one is enslaved by the tyranny of an empire that only served the few." There was a long pause, the room holding its breath as the Quran representative considered Harper's words. Then, to everyone's surprise, he nodded. "You have a point," he said, his voice quieter now, almost grudgingly. "But we will need guarantees. We need to know that the galaxy will not fall into chaos." "We can't promise you perfection," Harper said, "but we can promise you something better, a future built on equality, not fear." The Grand Representative didn't speak for a moment. Then, slowly, he turned to the other representatives and gave a single nod. "We'll support you, but you will need to prove that your vision can hold together." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. It wasn't the full victory we had hoped for, but it was a start. The Quran had agreed to join us. That was more than I had expected. Harper turned to face the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the other representatives. "This is our moment," he said. "The galaxy is watching. Let's show them that we can rise together." As the meeting concluded, I felt a strange sense of hope begin to blossom inside me. The journey was far from over, and there would be more battles ahead. But today, we had made progress. And for the first time in my life, I could see the possibility of a galaxy where the old ways of power, fear, and domination were replaced by something better. Something worth fighting for. The winds of change were blowing, and this time they were carrying us all forward. Together. The galaxy, once divided by the iron fist of the Dominion, now stood on the cusp of something unthinkable. The foundations of a new order had been laid, fragile though they were, and the representatives of the various species gathered here on New Century Prime knew they stood at the precipice of history. There was no going back now. The old empire was crumbling, its pieces scattered in the wake of humanity's audacious revolt, and the question that lingered on everyone's lips was simple. What comes next? I stood in the crowded Senate hall, watching the diplomats, the leaders, the visionaries of the galaxy. Their eyes, once full of skepticism, now glimmered with the faintest spark of hope, though tempered by the weight of the unknown. The air was thick with anticipation, every breath in the room held with bated expectation. The galaxy was changing, but whether it would rise from the ashes or fall into chaos still hung in the balance. Captain Harper stood at the center of the room, his face hard, but his eyes carrying a quiet determination that seemed to cut through the tension. Behind him, a holographic projection flickered, a map of the galaxy. Lines and dots marked out trade routes, borders, and outposts, but for the first time, they weren't drawn in blood or fear. They were drawn with the hope of unity. "We have come far," Harper's voice echoed through the hall, steady and strong, "but this is just the beginning. Today, we lay the first stone of a new future for the galaxy. A future where no species is subjugated, where every voice is heard. A future where we are not divided by the power we wield, but united by our shared will to create something better." There was a murmur of agreement in the room, but beneath it, I could sense the skepticism still clinging to the edges of the atmosphere. The old Dominion had been built on fear, on power, on the belief that the galaxy could only be ruled by the strongest. For centuries, its leaders had governed with an iron fist, and the galaxy had trembled at their feet. But the world had changed now. The Dominion had fallen, and in its place, we were attempting to build something new, something that could stand the test of time. But could it? Could this fragile dream of equality and unity actually take root? Or were we simply destined to repeat the cycle of power, war, and oppression once again? The vote was underway, a crucial moment that would determine the fate of the galaxy. All eyes were on the delegates, who sat with bated breath, their fingers hovering over the holographic voting pad in front of them. The fate of the Galactic Concordat rested in their hands. The document, a radical proposal to restructure the entire galaxy, giving each species a voice in the future, was being met with mixed reactions. The Quran, whose allegiance had once been uncertain, were now firmly behind the proposal, though I could sense their hesitation. Their voices had always been among the most powerful in the Dominion, and now, in this new age of cooperation, they had to decide whether they would let go of their old dominance. The Zelny, a proud and ancient race, seemed more reluctant, their gaze locked on the projections as they debated the ramifications of such a shift. But they had been forced to admit that they, too, were not immune to the tide of change. Even the once dominant Zeltari, Vox Talor's own people, now found themselves questioning the wisdom of their centuries-old rule. I glanced at Harper, who stood by the side of the podium, watching as the votes came in one by one. The weight of the moment hung heavy on him, but there was no fear in his expression, only resolve. He had fought for this. He had dragged an emperor across the Senate floor, humiliated the Dominion, and sparked a revolution. And now, the galaxy was watching, waiting to see if his vision would take flight, or if it would crash into the very same fate that had claimed so many before him. The holographic screen flickered as the final votes were cast, and the room fell silent. The results began to appear in bold, glowing letters. 1,837 in favor, 412 opposed, 51 abstained. The numbers hung there, glowing like a beacon. The proposal had passed. The new order was upon us. For a moment, there was only silence. The weight of the decision, the enormity of what we had just achieved, seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. The delegates, once skeptical, now exchanged looks, some of them smiling, others simply nodding as if they had just realized they were part of something far bigger than themselves. Then the murmurs began. Whispers of approval, of disbelief, of hope. The galaxy had voted for change. They had voted for unity. They had voted for a future where the powerful no longer ruled over the weak, where every species, no matter how small or how new, had the chance to shape the stars. Harper stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room one last time. "This is our victory," he said, his voice carrying through the hall, strong and unwavering. "But it's not just mine. It's ours. All of us. Today, we didn't just create a new order, we created a future where all of us can live side by side as equals, and this is just the beginning. There was a wave of applause, quiet at first, but then building into something louder, something more powerful. It wasn't the sound of celebration, it was the sound of a new dawn breaking across the galaxy. The empire that had once ruled with an iron fist was gone. In its place, a new, uncertain world was being born. And for the first time in centuries, I allowed myself to believe that it could be a better one. As the applause died down, I looked around the room at the faces of the representatives. Some were still cautious, still unsure. Others were smiling, their eyes alight with the possibilities that lay ahead. But one thing was certain. This was no longer just a dream. It was a reality that had been forged in the fire of rebellion, in the courage of those who had dared to stand up against tyranny. The galaxy had changed, and we would never be the same again. And so, the galaxy steps into a new age. The fight isn't over, but a new hope has emerged. Captain Harper's daring actions and the bravery of those who stood by him have ignited a spark that will light the way to a more just and unified galaxy. But the road ahead is still uncertain. Will this fragile alliance hold? Or will the forces of the Old Dominion rise again? Only time will tell. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think about the revolution and what you hope for the future of the galaxy. Your support means the world to us. Stay tuned for more, because the adventure is far from over.